Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the dive-in session on gender parity in leadership and what we can learn from emerging industries. By the end of this session, audience participants will be able to understand what gender parity looks like in emerging industries compared to traditional sectors, recognise biases that may exist in law and insurance about emerging industries, and understand how such biases can hinder progress. And finally, identify creative solutions based on lessons learned from emerging industries in order to address gender imbalance beyond the gender pay gap. This dive-in event will be moderated by myself, Rachel Doby, of Sompo International, and will facilitate in-depth discussion of the subject topic amongst three designated speakers who we have with us today. We have Helene Stanway, President of the Sense Consortium, Lauren Ingram, founder of Women of Web3 and our keynote speaker for today, and also Ingrid Hobbs, partner of Kennedy's LLP, who is replacing Suzanne Liversidge very helpfully this afternoon. I'm just going to go around the room to my panelists for everyone to do a brief, small introduction of themselves, after which I will thank them and we can move forward into keynote speaking. So beginning with Helene.
Hi, good afternoon, everybody. Very much looking forward to this conversation. So my background is operations, emerging technology and data. So previously I ran technology innovation for AXA XL. So I've got a good view on emerging technology and how that will change the world.
Thank you, Helene. And Lauren?
Hello, thank you so much for having me. So I spent the last 11 years across advertising agencies and tech companies, anywhere from tiny little tech startups of a few people all the way up to Meta when it was known as Facebook, which is something like 70 or 80,000 people. And I ran their program of She Means Business for female entrepreneurs. I now run Women of Web3, which is trying to educate as many women as possible about the world of Web 3.0. So things like NFTs, cryptocurrencies, the metaverse, because it is a very male-dominated field, and I would love to see more women enjoying success in it.
Marvellous, thank you. And Ingrid.
Hi everyone, I'm Ingrid Hobbs. I'm a partner at Kennedy's, which is a global law firm with offices in about 60 countries now. Suzanne Liversidge, our managing partner, sadly was unwell today, so she asked me to step in because I sit as joint global chair of our D&I meetings across the globe. And I worked before I joined Kennedy's 5 years ago for a large American law firm for 20 years. So I kind of have a good perspective on global D&I challenges. I'm very delighted to join you. Thanks.
We're delighted to have you. Thank you very much, Ingrid. So thank you all very much for joining this afternoon, all of my participants, and also to the speakers for their highly valued time. The event will begin, as mentioned, with a keynote from Lauren Ingram, followed by a full panel discussion and an opportunity for Q&A at the end. If you would like to ask any questions during the session, please do, and enter these questions into the chat at any time throughout. This chat will not be viewable or disruptive to the session and will be monitored by the session team, who will identify common themes amongst the question sets and try to ensure that all themes are addressed by the panel. Responses to these question themes will occur during the final part of the session. Now that you are all tuned in, I would like to hand over to the keynote speaker, Lauren Ingram, to fully begin the session. Lauren will be introducing us to the purpose of Web3, the need for female engagement in its creation, and its relevance to financial services. Lauren, thank you.
Thank you so much. Let me just present my slides. I'm really pleased to be here today and sort of sharing knowledge between industries. So I'm really interested in how the next sort of wave of the internet can become more equitable, and I'd like to share that today and sort of give you an overview of what Web 3.0 is, because you might be familiar with some of it, but probably not all of it. And so sort of whistle-stop tour. I've already told you briefly who I am. So yeah, I'm the founder of Women of Web3. I'm also helping businesses pivot towards Web 3.0, which I'll come on to what that means. And the other half of my job is running this community, Women of Web3, trying to help place women in roles in this sort of brand new area in jobs and educate them through a podcast. So I feel so excited about this set of technologies. It's the next major iteration of the internet that we're entering now, and it's going to be just as disruptive as the fintech startups that we've seen in the last sort of decade or so. So welcome to the age of the metaverse. Estimates vary, I would say, but Citi predicts that the metaverse economy is going to be worth anywhere between $8 trillion and $13 trillion. So while you might be wondering, okay, how does Web3 actually apply in insurance or financial services, it's something that at least shouldn't be ignored. So what do we actually mean by Web3? It is the third major iteration of the internet. So if Web 1.0 was websites as we know them, Web 2.0 was social media and connecting people up in a new way, as well as the sharing economy. So things like Uber and Airbnb, and Web 3.0, or just Web 3, it tends to get called. It's this next major wave, and it's partly a set of philosophies around decentralizing and moving sort of power back into the hands of the people, giving over power of the internet to the people, in theory. And it's also a set of technologies that I'm going to take you through in a moment. It's also a more immersive version of the internet with the metaverse, which I'm sure you'll have heard of, but again, might not be that familiar yet. So briefly on these philosophies, Web3 is this desire to democratize and give sort of pieces of ownership to individuals. And there is this desire to remove central institutions such as banking, financial services, traditional institutions, and remove the current social media players and give people's data back to them. I realize it's quite a utopian vision, and so you don't have to buy into all of it to be able to sort of explore this area, but it's just helpful to have that knowledge that that's this utopian end goal, is to decentralize. So as for the technologies, I'm going to do a quick jargon buster, because I do personally believe that the biggest barrier for adoption of these technologies, and also for women to succeed in this area, is breaking down language. It is such a jargon-filled area, like you wouldn't believe. It's a sort of deliberately opaque area sometimes, and I would love to change that. So you'll probably be familiar with some of these words, but again, there'll always be pockets of a sort of lack of knowledge, and so I'm hoping to just give you the super basics. So you could consider the blockchain as this, it's a decentralized distributed ledger of data. So it's a bit like a spreadsheet that's owned and run by the people. So lots of different computers have the same information, and in order to make any changes or kind of additions to that, they all have to validate it. So it is a very secure way of transacting. You can't delete the data that's already there, and it's most of the time it's also very public. So I can sort of go and look up what transactions, money going in and out of a business or a charity, if this is operating on the blockchain. So it is quite revolutionary in that sense, and it has been around for a few years, but there is this renewed interest in funding and excitement for this area. Related to that is crypto, or cryptocurrency, and DeFi, which is decentralized finance. I do think, again, crypto has this reputation as being deliberately opaque, and I think it's it sounds like the word cryptic, and it's almost on purpose that they sort of lock other people out, and I think that's a real shame, because it could be quite revolutionary. DeFi and crypto is all about sort of banking on the blockchain, removing centralized institutions, banks, etc. So you can actually just put essentially sort of two crypto wallets together, and using code you can transfer cryptocurrency from one to another. I suppose it is technology enabled cash. It's digital cash, and they are very much after sort of banks and financial services. They're after your lunch. So again, sort of ignore at your peril. And NFTs are quite closely connected to that, because those are digital assets that are sort of traded on the blockchain. NFT stands for non-fungible token, but to be honest, I don't think that helps anybody. Like, no one really cares what fungible means. They are unique digital assets. So it could be a piece of artwork, a piece of music, anything that could be a digital file. It can be a way of denoting ownership. It's essentially a barcode on the blockchain. So because of the immutable nature of the blockchain, it is a really helpful way of showing ownership. And so while you'll probably have only really seen headlines about whether it's scams in the NFT space, or about sort of pictures of sort of monkey cartoons selling for millions of dollars, actually a lot of the time buying an NFT is about buying access to a community, or a sort of almost like a membership club. So I think that's got some really interesting applications in every area of business, and it's not just about buying and selling digital art. DAOs is probably the part that you're least familiar with, I would imagine. A DAO is a decentralized autonomous organization. You'll see what I mean about the need to break down jargon in this area, because otherwise it's just not going to be, we're not going to see mass adoption. So a DAO is almost like a cooperative or a collective of people sharing their funds together. A lot of the time that's cryptocurrency or a sort of another kind of token on a blockchain. Those tokens essentially are your voting rights. And what's interesting in this, if you're making decisions as a group of people, as a consensus on something, because of smart contracts, I'm not going to bore you with the details, but just sort of know that that's coding on the blockchain that sits behind these DAOs, behind NFTs. It means that if you vote on a decision, that decision is then executed automatically. It goes into action immediately. And I do think that's quite interesting as sort of, technology enabled way of running a company. And so while I don't think it's going to replace companies as we know them today, I do think you're going to start hearing more and more about them. And again, they might be a sort of alternative model for things like insurance. And finally, the metaverse, another sort of bombastic, something that's been a bit overblown, a lot of hype around it. It's essentially a sort of immersive 3D internet. So if you were in the same way as we have sort of websites or using apps on our phone and social media and all of that, we think of just as the internet. That's what the metaverse will be for the way we use the internet in the future. It will be immersive. There'll be aspects of virtual reality, augmented reality. It'll just be a more, we'll move between virtual worlds and it will feel much more seamless. And that's certainly more than it does today. So today's craze is sort of TikTok videos. Next, it's going to be virtual worlds, and it will just be the way we interact and meet with people on the internet. So what does that actually mean for you? I'll keep this really brief at the sort of types of applications you can imagine. Blockchain, if you're not implementing it already in your business, I can imagine it's going to be used heavily in terms of security and sort of secure ways of transacting. Crypto, as I say, there is this huge amount of innovation and funding in this space. And so they are after your lunch. It's just something worth being aware of and learning more about. And it's also, as you'll have seen, incredibly volatile. But that is starting to change because it's starting to more closely mirror the stock market. NFTs, I think, could have real world applications in your industry because of things like it might be replacing a loyalty program would be you just have an NFT instead, or you might send, instead of a policy document, you could send your NFT, which is this kind of immutable digital file. And again, that's sort of quite exciting new use cases. DAOs, could be an alternative to insurance. I definitely don't see it as replacing insurance, but if you think of where insurance started coming into existence, I think maybe it's the 1600s. I could have that wrong, my insurance history, but that was kind of individuals coming together and pooling their money. And so this would be a sort of technology enabled way of doing that. And there is something interesting to me about that. The metaverse is absolutely open to interpretation for now. It's again, I wouldn't dismiss it out of hand, but again, it's about learning as much as possible and then thinking about how, if at all, this will apply for your business. But if before we couldn't imagine having video calls between, say, customer service agents and our customers, and now that's starting to become the norm, you can imagine how virtual worlds might apply too. However, amongst all this amazing innovation, there is already a gender problem, and there's quite a severe lack of diversity, which really worries me, actually. So only 4% of NFT sales have been of work by female artists. This data is from the beginning of this year, but from operating in this space myself, I would say this looks about right. Or I'm sure it's still sub 10%. It's quite concerning. And similarly, only 5% of cryptocurrency entrepreneurs are women. And I think that's because it's spun out of traditional finance and crossed with gamer or sort of gaming culture, and you've ended up with a hyper male environment. So yeah, it is a concern. If we don't bring in the right ideals and think about diversity and inclusion right now, we're going to end up with rather than a sort of utopian vision for the next version of the internet, it could be a dystopian nightmare. And it doesn't really make sense for men to be making all of the decisions or taking all of the risks and then reaping all of the rewards. And I'm sure, to be honest, I think men would agree with that too. You don't want 100% or 96% of anything, really, in the same way as you wouldn't want it 100% female. So yeah, there is, the digital world is kind of very much up for grabs at the moment and up for moulding. So thinking finally about how that could play out, of some steps I think we need to take in order to make a sort of more inclusive next internet. It isn't too late. We could be thinking about inclusion using language, sort of breaking down barriers using sort of breaking down jargon. I do think it's going to be incredibly important to elevate the visibility of women in the sort of Web3 and crypto and NFT space, or it's a broader blockchain, because there aren't nearly enough women, and we would love to see more of them and celebrate their wins. And finally, it's asking the hard questions about if we're architecting this whole new industry or area of the internet and how, you know, people around the world will interact with the internet, we need to be being thoughtful about that and asking each other hard questions about, okay, who is making money in this? Like, who is represented in this space? Or, you know, we're building in the metaverse, like what's the kind of default skin color? Is there a default skin kind of color? And then finally I think affordability, because already the NFT market and even crypto is kind of unaffordable to most individuals, and only people with quite a lot of money can really afford to take that level of risk. So what I'd like to leave you with today is just two closing thoughts, if I can get my cat to get out of the way. Firstly, there is a huge amount of hype around this area. There's sort of insane valuations and costs of NFTs and that kind of thing. And while not everybody needs to kind of release an NFT or create a metaverse, I would say ignore it at your peril. I think every business is going to need a strategy around this, even if the strategy is, okay, we're learning about it, but we're not going to act. And secondly, and finally, I think that getting women excited and included and interested even in this space is going to be absolutely critical, and the same with marginalized genders and underrepresented communities. And if we see that kind of diversity and that kind of inclusion, it will work for everybody. It will be in everybody's benefit. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much for that, Lauren. That was really fantastic insight. And I think it certainly provides a really great platform for discussion on gender parity in leadership and furthermore around what we can learn from emerging industries. So on that note, carrying on from your presentation, how do you all, my panelists, think that gender parity in leadership in emerging industries compares to traditional industry sectors such as law and finance?
Coming off me, I'll start and then others can build. I think if we're looking at gender, I'm not convinced actually that it is that different from traditional industries. It might be perceived as more exciting because it's a startup and I can wear jeans and a polo shirt rather than a suit or what have you. But I think for me, it stems much more right back to the cat, no, right back to kind of the school age, and how do we actually get people included right from the get-go before they even start their careers, so that we have a bigger pool of talent that we can access. I mean, my bugbear is, you know, my son is doing computer science at A-level. There are 90 individuals in his year group taking the A-level. There's one girl. Now, if we cannot even get people to take these technology qualifications into the workforce, I guess it goes back to your comment, Lauren. How do we include them once they get into the workplace? And actually, how do we skill them? Because they're not going to come ready-made skills, because they won't necessarily have a computer science A-level. So it stems right from school for me.
Yeah, I would add to that, Helene, that the law now and finance, I can't speak to it to the same degree, but the law is now more than 50%. I mean, the latest stats I looked up this morning, 63% of undergraduates studying law are women. Now, if you roll back, it wasn't like that even 30 years ago. So I think that it's progress and knowledge, having people like Lauren speak about this and making people understand what it is and how accessible it is. We've worked hard to make the law more interesting than just black letters on the page, and people understand now how relevant it is to today's world. I think it's making whatever your career path is very relevant to the next generation, and there's nothing more relevant than what you've just outlined for us. So it is outreach into the schools, and maybe businesses going to speak to people at a younger age rather than leaving it to the last year when people are doing careers advice. I'm in the same situation as you. I have a 17-year-old son who's doing his A-levels. He's not taking a tech subject, but I've had a bit of a look at the careers advice, and it's still woeful, because the people who are giving it haven't experienced the world that Lauren and Helene are breathing and living every day. And I think we need more outreach into the schools so that people understand what sort of career paths tech would open up for them.
Yeah, and just to compare that with Web3 at the moment, I would say for now, things are worse in Web3 because there is this desperate move forwards of sort of just trying to build very quickly, and so there's sort of lack of thought around diversity and inclusion. There aren't policies in place, and I'm hearing from women I know working in different, say like a crypto startup or something like that, that they're finding it incompatible with the idea of starting a family, which is concerning. But I think overall I'm optimistic that could change, because I think because startups are on this kind of learning and growth trajectory, I think they're able to implement changes much faster.
Yeah, I think women actually have to own this in every industry and stop putting up with this nonsense about, she's not really on the career path now because she's taken some time out to have some children. That happens in all industries. It happens in the law still. And I think we've got to say that, pick the bits of the technology that allow us to debunk that myth and say we are fantastic at multitasking. We're very, very dexterous with our brains in our approach to problem solving, and we can work with our colleagues and run families. And the flexibility that these technology tools offer us allows us to do that in a more amenable way for our lives. But what we cannot have is people who don't have anything else in their lives. And I throw that out beyond gender. People who are one track, only interested in the career, nothing else, expecting everybody in the slipstream to do the same thing. That is not what the youth of today want. They want more approaches to flexibility. And if you can show women that these tools allow them to have portfolio careers, more interesting careers, and flex their time to suit them, rather than saying, we're just going to flood you with work all the time. It does worry me, like we've all become slaves to the email. Clients expect immediate answers, and the pandemic didn't help us, because we were all stuck at home, and we became apologists for the extra time we had when we weren't commuting, so we used it to work more. And now we sort of set the bar up here somewhere, and I think we kind of have to use the technology, like train it like a pet rather than letting it run off and rule us, and then we can really, really, I think, make it very, very attractive to women.
I think just to kind of round that point out on the pandemic and taking time out, what I'm seeing in the insurance industry is so positive that more and more men are taking much, much longer paternity leaves. And actually that then becomes normalized for us as individuals, and then everybody can experience the work and the family balance, because men just as much want to spend time with their children, and actually now that's accessible for them in a much more positive way than it has been in the last handful of years. So that's really, really positive.
Absolutely. Thank you, all of you. And in all of your individual experiences within your own kind of worlds of leadership, where have you seen companies succeeding when it comes to gender inclusion and equity, and in what ways have they achieved that success?
I'll start with an example. I was at AXA XL, and we had one of our execs, and we were presenting a client pitch, and this particular gentleman was of a very inclusive mindset, and he recognized that he suddenly saw a group of men in front of him who were going to go pitch to the client, and he straight away said, no, that's not how we want to represent ourselves. We need to have a diversity of people facing off to the client. And he asked me, as emerging tech lead, and there was this really awkward pause. I'm like, I can't actually do that particular meeting in that particular time. And he did not pause. And he said to me, no problem, just record your segment. And it was just like, oh my goodness, how inclusive was that? Didn't even need to think about it. But the point of that kind of example is it's those every single day behaviours that reinforce that inclusivity that make the difference.
Yeah, I mean, I've chatted in advance of this session with some people in our HR department and Rani, who's on the line. And also yesterday I attended a dive-in pre-breakfast with some of the leaders in insurance and Lloyd's. And I suppose the common thread that runs through wanting not just women to be treated the same way, but also everybody to stop seeing the differences between the skin colours and the genders and, you know, how people identify, is people starting to look at what the skill sets are for the jobs, not what the face behind the person who's going to do the job looks like. You know, and I think that was what came out of what Mark Lomas at Lloyd's was saying. There was a really interesting example he gave, and I'm going to share it now because I find it so fascinating as a good indicator of where we've got to. Apparently, one of the big mining companies in Australia were looking to recruit new mine operators, and they decided to take a different approach because their traditional adverts were not working. So they looked at what the characteristics that were necessary for the job were. They put the characteristic list together, they ran these through a computer, and the computer said the best people for that job were actually nurses. So they went out and recruited nurses and trained them to be mine operators. And I think that a lot of what we do tomorrow is fill with our experiences of yesterday, you know, our what we think a person who does a job looks like or should look like. And I think we've just got to move away from that. And that's where the technology that Lauren is talking about, you know, really makes a difference. I mean, the metaverse is a kind of blur to me, but I understand that we might all be able to hide behind avatars so no one really knows what we look like. And, you know, we can kind of forge relationships based on criteria other than how we present ourselves.
It's really interesting. I was just going to pick up on your last comment. So when we were prepping for this panel, that particular topic came up. And it was, do you know what? Oh my goodness me, the metaverse can be so inclusive because you can be who you want to be. I mean, I'll go back to my son. He plays Fortnite. He happens to have an avatar that is a woman with a unicorn hammer or something. I don't get it. Anyway, and actually you can play who you want to play. And I was like, well, actually, that's quite inclusive. And then when I reflected in the coming days, I'm like, actually, is it? Because actually you are playing a role.
Yeah.
You're not playing yourself. And actually, if you're not playing yourself and you feel you have to be, for example, a man in this metaverse in order to get on or whatever it is, actually, is that setting us back? And I certainly don't have the answer, but I was really reflecting on that as a topic, because you don't have so much representation in the same ways you do in the real world. And you're playing a role, you're not playing yourself in order to get on. And actually, is that setting us back?
Yeah, we actually had a chat about this, because I was saying where I could see it being useful is if you want to get to know someone before you meet them, so that you can impress them again with your abilities and your characteristics for the task at hand rather than your shell, then perhaps operating with people in the metaverse before you meet them allows those stereotypes to fall away. Because with the parallel I drew badly was if you read a book, if all four of us were to read a book tomorrow, we would all have a different image in our minds of the main character in that book. We might all like the main character in that book, but when we meet them, the disappointment about how they appeared in comparison to how we thought they might look would be momentary, but we would then realize, well, we like them anyway. We know who they are and we know their characteristics. And I think that would be a bit like the metaverse. You would iron out any predisposition to preferring one kind of thing over another. And then when you met the person, you would already know them. So the shell would be less important. So I think it might be helpful in that sense, you know, for interviewing maybe at the intake stage, ironing out those differerences and trying to make it more about the characteristics.
That could be quite fun, having interviewing unicorns instead. I mean, it is an alternative way of kind of removing those aspects of your identity and including sort of the diversity element. I think because also in sort of wider Web3, not just the metaverse, but thinking about that sort of devolving central powers away, there's also a desire for anonymity on the internet. It's not something I personally desire, and when I sort of launched myself into this area, I did wonder, should I be anonymous because have a sort of I don't know, a sort of character name or a handle and a profile picture, but should I hide my real identity because that is the sort of the trend in this area? But I actually felt like as a woman I might have more to lose if I lost my anonymity, because I wasn't sure how to maintain my anonymity on a sort of long-term basis. And so I was thinking, I feel like it's something that can be taken away from me. So I would rather just start off as myself, and then I know where I stand, and so does everybody else.
Lauren, if I can ask you, sorry, this is a bit off piece, but why do you think that people want to be anonymous and not, integrate and participate in dialogue as themselves? What is the attraction about that?
I think there's an element of a lack of accountability. That's my honest answer, is I think there's some desire in that respect. But I think it's also a sort of reaction to, at the moment, everyone's data being everywhere. There's, if you look at my LinkedIn page, you can sort of see what university I went to, what grade I got, every single, like internship. There's so much real data about me and about everybody else out there. And so there's this desire to kind of take all of that back in and say, okay, you're not going to know me at all, then you'll just see how I behave. That's my sort of honest answer.
Thank you, all of you. That was really great group discussion. And across all of those, in all of the industries that we work in, so obviously we have a blend of insurance, IoT, law, Web3, etc. in the room now. Across all of those kind of areas, what do you think the biggest barriers to progress within gender parity in leadership will be?
I personally think the jargon point is still massive. I mean, actually, the fact that embarrassingly, I don't know what IUC stands for, but this isn't my industry. I do think inclusive language is so important. So not just breaking down jargon as we go, but thinking about the words that we use and the impact of that. Whether it's in sort of job descriptions everywhere, I feel like I feel like it was almost a sort of trend a few years ago to be scrutinizing job descriptions, etc., and as to sort of gendered language, etc. But I do still think it still has relevance now. We still need to be asking ourselves those questions about the language that we use. I think for me, the other big barrier is around, and we touched on it already, things like parental leave, making the working world work better for women, for parents, for sort of real life, for real families. And I think there's still such a lack of transparency around parental leave. For me, that should be listed alongside the pay, the pension, the free fruit every day. Okay, and this is what mothers and fathers can expect to get. That should be something I make my decision on when I'm interviewing for a role.
I think it's interesting. There's a couple of questions that have come up on the chat, and a bit of a spoiler is, one of the blockers is how do you actually remain relevant in terms of your knowledge base? So you've done a brilliant session there, Lauren, on Web3, highly educational, and it's only by people coming to listen to you now and today and taking the time out to learn that they're going to do that. Because unless the leadership understand what is coming, how important it is, the impact of this type of thing will have, how can they possibly make a decision for their entire organization? But actually, how many leaders take the time out to learn and to keep their knowledge current throughout their day? There is a reason, for example, why Google implemented a 20%, 80-20 kind of working practice, where people could spend 20% of their time either working on projects and thereby learning, or doing structured learning. And actually, we certainly as an insurance industry, we hire for 100% productivity, when actually we should be hiring, as an example, for 80%, because actually we're spending 20% of our time. Well, what is Web3? I'm going to go and have a look at that. I'm going to go and find a course. Or what is Internet of Things, which is IoT? What is that? How can I find out about? What impact does it have on risk management? Because actually, in my experience of new technologies and the impact that it can have on risk, it's massive. but the adoption is almost non-existent because people are not taking the time to learn about it, understand the impact. I mean, there's more than one reason, but that's part of it. And as leaders, it's incumbent upon us to keep learning, keep educating, so we can make those decisions in these new worlds.
Yeah, I mean, I find it interesting to listen to Lauren's observations. She started off by saying it was the sort of democratization of the internet, this phase, and yet it feels to me when I listen to the jargon and the way you speak about it that it's the most exclusive thing that's claiming to be inclusive. And how can we change that? And I think that again, it is literally all about people, individuals acting with kindness and fairness and listening to others in both directions. So older people in the workplace will not have the same IT skills as the youth coming through, because we weren't born holding mobile phones and able to operate games before we could speak. And yet, we have different skill sets and experiences that are still very relevant. And therefore, it needs to be dialogue with up and down. But I would say that any industry that keeps coming out with endless amounts of jargon and almost wanting to create a mystique about itself, rather than opening the doors and saying, look, let's strip a lot of this stuff away. This is what it all means, like you did for us today. That would be a much better way of opening the doors and encouraging people to embrace its use. If you continue to make yourself a kind of difficult barrier rather than an enabler, then I think you're never going to get the engagement with everybody that you're looking for.
Yeah, absolutely agree. That was actually literally the reason I started Web3 was just navigating these. I don't know if you'd heard of Discord. Like again, teenage sons might be using them to sort of using Discord to communicate with friends, but it's also very popular in NFTs and crypto, etc. Sort of it's a bit like Slack or Teams or a sort of instant messenger, and I just felt I've never felt so excited by a set of technologies or so locked out, and a lot of that was to do with, you're right, it's deliberately excluding, and they're sort of using language like saying when Lambo, and that's when am I going to get my Lamborghini because I've made so much money from NFTs, things like that. There's so much slang, and I just felt like there's such a big opportunity to bring more people in and just sort of make sense of this, demystify it, break it all down, and then people can decide for themselves if they think this is something worth participating in it. But when it's just about that mystique, then it actually makes people more fearful that, like, oh, this is actually maybe just smoke and mirrors and not actually a technology worth investing my time and money in.
Yeah, absolutely. And in terms of kind of investing time and money in certain areas, and I don't mean to kind of ask you all to get out a crystal ball for the kind of final part of the panel discussion, but what do you think the biggest changes will actually be when it comes to diversity and inclusion in the next 5 to 10 years, and how much of this might be down to emerging technologies?
I'm going to put some wishes out there as opposed to maybe putting a crystal ball out there. I would love to see new technologies improve risk. So I've got my insurance hat on and my technology hat on, because there are so many technologies where you can model, where you can experiment with scenarios, where you can, test and learn without actually damaging the real world. For example, one of the things that we did was we created a virtual world where something would flood. And it was through a HoloLens, and we actually took that to the client site where they could put this HoloLens on and it would virtually flood around them so that they could actually understand the damage where they were in their location. Now, that was far more powerful than this, paper virtual document of you must move your stuff off the floor because otherwise it's going to get damaged in a flood. So my aspiration with these technologies is that it changes behavior for the better to improve risk, and there's even much more exciting, I don't know if that's the right thing, much more exciting training videos on health and safety, but actually if you're much more immersed in this and you physically or virtually feel the impact of either dangerous behavior or educating to improve behavior, I think that would be my wish.
I've also got a sort of kind of a wish to share, which is I hope that with diversity, equity and inclusion, we can move away from doing things at sort of one aspect of diversity at a time. So I know I'm guilty of this with creating women of Web3, you know, next is it going to be people of colour in Web3, and then we can think about disability. You know, I hope that that won't be the case in terms of the approach in a sort of new emerging area, and actually more broadly in the working world. It's not necessarily very helpful to just do things one at a time and say, oh, sorry, our big disability push isn't until 2024, so you'll have to wait and you can get included then. But just briefly on the Web3 point, I do think it's got, I'm optimistic about how it could empower women economically. For example, you know, they can like form their own DAOs or, you know, be investing in crypto themselves. When thinking about the sort of broader spectrum of women around the world, I think this technology has really big potential. And overall, despite what I've said at the beginning about the figures of women in Web3, I am optimistic about where things can go next.
I'll round off with a lawyer comment that relates to time, because we charge our clients by the billable hour, which I would love to see change actually, because it means that women are rewarded for the hours they work rather than the contribution they make. In fact, not women, all of us are rewarded in the law for the hours we work, not the contribution we make. And the two are not always at one. And I think that technology should enable us to be more nimble and productive with our time. And from a billing perspective, the whole blockchain piece really interests me, because there are lots of tiers in our processes where we're working on very large international cases. We have brokers involved, we have loss adjusters involved, we have a market of insurers involved on one risk where they share that risk, called a subscription market. And it would be wonderful if we had a more secure and fast method of collecting money and moving money, where we weren't stopping at every single one of those hurdles and it was impacting all of the businesses involved negatively. So I would love to see it used more progressively for moving money in the insurance markets, both with the service providers and with the insureds.
Thank you. And thank you all of you actually for that entire panel discussion. That was really, really insightful. And thank you for bringing all of your individual experiences together for us all today. Throughout all of that, therefore, there have been some questions being posted into the chat, and I thank all participants for your enthusiasm and delivering there. So let me have a quick look at what we have. I'm going to try and keep them to general panel questions where I can. So this is quite an interesting one. It does specifically mention the metaverse, but it's definitely a general panel question, as I'd certainly be interested in the kind of general opinion on this. Could it be said that in the realm of the metaverse and being represented by an avatar, so you are not appearing as you are, that actually this may not work towards inclusivity, a world where everyone can really be who they are?
I think it goes back to a little bit kind of the earlier discussion about you're playing you are literally and figuratively playing a role and is that more who you are or less who you are? That's only for you to decide. But I do think it's going to be interesting to see kind of how you have the role models and the representation to make it okay to move from being genuinely role playing to be more who you are, and assuming everybody is an honest actor in all of this, because not everybody will be, and how can you be true to yourself in that realm? I don't know the answer is the short answer there.
Just briefly, and this is a bit of a negative to share, but an interesting thing that we need to be thinking about is there was a case of a woman being essentially assaulted in the metaverse. And so as a result, Meta, who were Facebook, have sort of implemented in their virtual worlds that you can't sort of come within a certain number of centimeters or meters of another avatar. Because if you think about it, it'd be a bit like in real life, if somebody just came and sort of stood right on your face, even though we're talking about virtual worlds, it has real world impact on those individuals. And so I think we need to be sort of having conversations with our sort of teenage kids and sort of younger children about if we're sort of playing, you know, in a virtual world, are you playing against a computer, or are there real humans behind those avatars? And therefore, what is the impact of what you do and say in those spaces?
Or maybe taking it one step further and saying, please God, let us at some point come out from behind the avatars and actually still meet each other, because I know that I am not up in any shape or form for a world where I never actually have a glass of wine and say cheers to somebody and hear the clink of a glass rather than seeing it on a screen. And I'm not up for, you know, my team are all different ages and I'm very close to some of them, and I know that some of them are using online dating, you know, apps at times. And I say sometimes, what about IRL? In real life? Can you not actually just meet people in real life? Because there's always this like disappointment, I think. You know, it's a bit like having a sweet and a lovely wrapper, and when you unwrap it, you realize it's actually just an old runty thing that's gone on past its sell-by date. You know, that you want to actually see the people and deal with people sincerely wherever you are, in the metaverse or in real life. But I don't like this idea that we all become a kind of faux version of ourselves, and that somehow it just increases our insecurities because we want to be a better version of ourselves in the metaverse, and at some point somewhere we're going to let somebody down. So I would say let's try and stick as much to our authentic person as we can, even if we're operating in the metaverse.
Okay. And then kind of on that note, in terms of authenticity or being, you know, what you really do identify kind of with, again, a general question to all of you: how can you negotiate or navigate, in all of your opinions, the balance between feeling like your employer is being inclusive by having women in the room, and feeling like the token woman, so by only being in the room because you are a woman? And what are your thoughts on that?
I mean, for me at the moment, I'm embracing being the token woman, partly because I don't really feel like I have any choice, and partly I'm hoping to use my position by sort of, say, being one of the few women speaking about Web3 technologies, hoping to use that as an opportunity to advocate for other women and other underrepresented groups to sort of get into it and feel represented and like they could belong in this new emerging space.
I must admit, I mean, I've been in plenty of rooms where I'm the only woman, and I take that responsibility exceptionally seriously. Because it is about some of the stuff that we talked about. It's showing different skills, different perspectives. But I mean, I, for example, have had a couple of career moves where I've moved from operations into technology, and I didn't have a technology background, but I learned about technology, and that was both scary because you're vulnerable, because you don't have the you know, the knowledge, but it's also very empowering because actually it leads you to rely on your skills versus your knowledge. But that's about being a person with a different perspective, not necessarily just because I'm a woman, but I do take that representation and that that honor to be that person in the room very, very seriously.
I don't like the expression token woman, and Lauren, you're not a token woman. You're a woman operating in a space that at the moment is largely dominated by people other than women. But that doesn't mean you're a token woman. It just means that we need to get more different people into that space. And that's how we did it in the law. When I started, I was often the only woman in the room, but I never thought I'm here because I'm a woman. I was there because I qualified as a lawyer, and I was invited to the meeting because I had a purpose. And I think that everybody has to believe that when they're in a meeting or in a space, they're there because they've got a purpose. And if you don't feel you've got the purpose and you think you've been invited for the wrong reason, then I think you should challenge the person who invited you and say, can I just check why I'm here? But other than that, I think that it's just a journey we're all on, and that when you invade this space and start talking more and more, you'll invite more people to come along who are of diverse backgrounds, of all descriptions, and then it will be a world that is much more equitable, and there will be far fewer minorities. It'll just be a mix of people all doing the job because they have the right characteristics. It's back to that point about the characteristics.
That's a really interesting point to kind of mention there, just as the third contributor, Ingrid, because there's some really interesting questions coming through around how women can find opportunities to break into the emerging technologies? And do we think that the apprenticeships or schools that exist now will be suitably skilled up with emerging technologies as subjects? So as you say, kind of bringing that knowledge to the world and having that validity there and creating equality in that way. Do you think we as a society are moving forward enough in that space?
I have a particular bugbear about apprenticeships. I think they're really good, but people assume that they are for school leavers, and apprenticeships are for anybody and everybody at whatever point in your career. And yet we don't take them up. You know, there is an apprenticeship levy out there for organisations of a certain size. There is money there for you to do training. Goes back to that 80-20% rule or stat. Nobody takes it up. Nobody takes the time. And yet we, certainly as an insurance industry, we then give millions of pounds back to the government because we don't spend it. And yet we have a skills problem when we have a talent problem. I mean, the components of that equation are there, but we need to figure out how to piece this together to make that successful. I mean, I go back to the thing, I don't think schools is necessarily the answer. You know, my son's computer science degree is Visual Basic as his coding language. Not sure that's especially relevant these days. Why isn't it Python? Why isn't it something more modern? But apprenticeships, you know, I would embrace wholeheartedly because they're out there for people to do it, assuming they're allowed the time to do it and to upskill. But it has to be, you know, it really needs to be used, and it's such a shame that it's not.
I would agree with that. When thinking about how women can sort of find opportunities in this space or sort of break into this area, actually, I do hope to do partnerships with schools actually at some point, getting sort of, you know, year 7 and upwards women, girls thinking about, you know, careers in this space or the sort of applications of this technology and get them excited about it. But thinking about adults that are wanting to pivot into this area, that is also something that I'm working on with Women of Web3 is I've got a sort of jobs board and a talent collective of women that are saying we have sort of relevant, we have experience, just not in Web3, and we would love to work in this. And then I'm sort of charging employers who are desperate for more female talent because they, you know, they've say they've got like 4 male founders. They've ended up with a sort of all male team because they haven't thought about it, and then they're thinking, oh, we haven't got any women on our team, so that's one sort of jobs point of view. Is there are other sort of jobs boards and ways to get in that way, but I think also there is so much to learn, and lots of ways to go and learn about Web3 and the metaverse. So like maybe some thought starters would be the Ethereum website, Ethereum being one of the major blockchains. That's where so most NFTs are sort of bought and sold on that blockchain using a current cryptocurrency called Ether. They on their website, they actually sort of break down like what is Web3, what are the sort of principles of it, what's important about it, what can we build using blockchain. That's a helpful starting point. And also Twitter, surprisingly, for all the bile that we associate sometimes with Twitter, the Web3 version of it, or, you know, like the people that are operating Web3 and have Twitter handles associated with that, is actually a pretty welcoming place, and people are sort of constantly sharing their learnings, partly because they want to establish themselves as thought leaders, but it means that there's just kind of this like free-for-all of information. So also just say it can get a little bit overwhelming when you start this kind of learning journey. It's like sort of sticking your head in a portal into another dimension. It's a lot. So also just kind of remember to take breathing breaks.
I can only really speak for the law from my experience of apprenticeships, but Kennedy's runs a very progressive apprenticeship program, and I think that part of the challenge is, it's for me now, it's less about male female, because as I say, there's a lot of women doing law degrees and coming into the law at the junior end more than men now, but it's about accessing social mobility and opening up the career for people of diverse backgrounds, so that perhaps people who can't afford to go to university can come straight in and have a really fantastic career. And I think that is, you know, it's the same thing about, it's debunking the myth about something that you think is not for you for whatever reason. So if you think that technology is not for you, in my case, because I'm, not very good at some of it, then, you know, I need to try and tackle that and challenge myself. And I think that we do outreach into schools to try and get people to come and believe that they can become a lawyer, even though no one in their family or the social circle has ever suggested it or done it themselves. And actually that's a point on the technology front as well, that, you know, until you see people like you doing the jobs that you might aspire to, it's far more of a challenge for you to believe you can do it. So Lauren, if you and Helene in your ways can get more women and more diverse people into technology, then I think there will be then a sort of flood of people following, and it will be the same experience for those industries as we've had in the law. And now, as I say, we've got more women than men. And the next challenge is to get the more women into the senior leadership roles. That's another topic for another day.
Completely agree. We've got about 3 minutes left of the session, but I just thought I'd ask one final one that's come in. Are there any further starting points or practical steps that could be used as a complete novice to anything in the technology world, aside from obviously listening to Lauren's podcast?
I probably would just add, actually, when I said get on Twitter, also listen to Twitter Spaces, because if you start following a few key figures in this space, I'm trying to think who would be a helpful person. Actually, Randy Zuckerberg, older sister of Mark Zuckerberg, she's great actually. She's got a startup called Hug, and it's all about kind of being like the friendliest place in Web3 to kind of go and learn, break down jargon, and they are really passionate about diversity and inclusion and explaining things in just simple language. So that's really quite a helpful starting point.
Thanks, I like the sound of that. Okay, I'm going to take this opportunity to round up discussion and just to thank all of the speakers for responding and all attendees for joining this discussion and contributing to the topic via their questions and continuing to further the debate. We hope this has drawn attention to the entire audience to a very important subject within diversity and inclusion, and that everyone has taken valuable learnings from it. And finally, thank you to the whole Diving team who I've worked with on this event over the past few months for all playing in very important roles in curating and delivering this session. Thank you, everyone, and have a really wonderful day.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.